Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us. I know the episode's a little bit late today, just coming about, a day or so, half a day or so late. But it makes sense because we had to reorganize the schedule somewhat because we have some pretty big upcoming news. It is Saturday morning here in the United States, but the sun has already risen in Moscow, where it seems like Vladimir Putin's Ministry of Defense regime, the regular state Russian military, could be under attack from the Wagner Group special forces after a pretty stunning video posted by their leader. Pretty much Russia's Navy SEALs, their elite fighting forces, have now seemed to have possibly turned their guns on Moscow and the main regime. We'll give you everything you need to know about that, provide some of the context, and really get into some of just the rampant speculation as to what's going on at this point. Also, the Titan submersible has had an ending to its story. We'll take a look at how it was processed and why another ship that we talked about barely got a shrug from the rest of the world, and another example of the comically corrupt Kristen Sinema. I guess that would just be another example of the comically corrupt Kristen Sinema being comically corrupt. But yeah, we'll save that for the end of the show. But right now, some really insane stuff coming out of Russia at the moment, kind of in the context of a counter-offensive that doesn't seem to have gone too well for Ukraine. But, they have taken some territory. Definitely, they made some advancements, but it has not been anything too crazy. It was really kind of thrown into disarray, I guess you could say, over these past, 5, 6, 7 hours as we're recording today, because the head of the Wagner Group, Evgeny Prigozhin, released a pretty remarkable video today, as Russian generals have accused him, as the New York Times calls him, mercenary tycoon. He is, again, the leader of the Wagner Group, this kind of mercenary fighting force group that Russia kind of sends out to do its dirty work. It's kind of the most, viewed as some of the most brutal, effective fighters in the Russian army. They have now been accused of trying to mount a coup against Putin because of some anger about the war. It really is some pretty remarkable stuff. It really seems to, it was long in the making. We've seen some stories going back in the past about the Wagner Group, showing some anger, some resistance, et cetera, but it has not been anything nearly like what we've seen today, with reports of them turning back from the front lines, kind of in the, oblasts, or the neighborhoods around the Ukrainian border with Russia in the west, and now really pushing back into this is right near the Donetsk and Luhansk area, this kind of southeastern part of Ukraine and the kind of southwestern border of Russia, and now pushing into a city called Rostov-on-Don, which is essentially right on the north, right on the northwestern side of the northeastern side of the Sea of Azov, which on the other side of that's Crimea. So just give you kind of a look into where we are in the world here. They are really in some pretty interesting territory here, because they are just on the front line, the first major city on the front line. There is now videos coming out that is really kind of remarkable of these tanks going down on the streets now as the sun rises. We've seen just armored personnel carriers, tanks that now appear to be the property not of the Ministry of Defense or the main Russian army, but of the Wagner Group forces surrounding Ministry of Defense and government outposts in that city of Rostov-on-Don. and they are now supposedly moving in and really moving northwards as well, and really flying past checkpoints of riot police, of people who are supposedly there to stop them but don't, really want to deal with what is a pretty well-equipped fighting force that is, by all accounts, pretty much ready to kill. Let's see what some of the beef is here. So Prigozhin on Friday accused the Russian military of attacking his Wagner mercenary forces, and in a series of recordings posted on social media, pledged that his fighters would retaliate. So pretty much, this is something that appears to, again, have been spurred on, possibly a major mistake here by Russia, appears to have been spurred on by some anger in terms of how open the dissent coming from this guy, Prigozhin has already been. He was already apparently very unhappy with the way the war was going, some of the decisions that were being made, and really what seems like the impetus for the whole war in the first place. So that got him apparently a shelling of his base and his forces, which apparently seems to really have set him off. Russian authorities turned, in turn, in response to his threats of retaliation, accused Prigozhin, whose broadsides against the Russian Defense Ministry had been tolerated by Putin for months, of trying to foment a revolt. This is a stab in the back of the country and the president, said General Vladimir Alexeyev, the deputy head of Russia's military intelligence agency, in a video appeal to Prigozhin's fighters, urging them to call off any rebellion, saying this is a coup. So this is a video, again, confirmed by the New York Times, essentially saying that the top Russian military intelligence general, essentially their director of the CIA, is coming out and saying, to what is essentially what could be roughly termed, again, in the American sense, Navy SEALs, top fighting forces, to say, you guys are doing a coup. Please stop with this. Disobey this man. He is leading you down, into a really rough place. So Prigozhin's Wagner military forces have proved pivotal to the Russian war effort in Ukraine, but in recent months he repeatedly chastised Russia's top brass for alleged corruption and indifference to regular soldiers' lives. On Friday night, he took his accusation to a new level, claiming the Russian military had attacked Wagner encampments, killing a huge number of fighters. The evil born by the country's military leadership must be stopped, said Prigozhin in one of these series of voice recordings posted to Telegram, the social network, after 9 p.m. Moscow time. And then since then, a whole night has passed. It's now 7:30 in the morning there. Minutes later, he suggested his Wagner mercenary forces were prepared to go on the offensive against Russia's own defense ministry, saying there's 25,000 of us. We're going to figure out why chaos is happening in the country. He denied the actions were a military coup, instead calling them a march for justice. Our actions aren't interfering with the troops in any way. Just past his Moscow time, midnight Moscow time, Russia's prosecutor general announced Prigozhin was being investigated on suspicion of organizing an armed rebellion and would face 20 years in prison if prosecutors, at the very least, probably something else would happen to him if he loses this battle. The Wagner leaders then finally took on Telegram again, saying his fighters were approaching the city of Rostov-on-Don, saying, very interestingly, we are going farther, we will go to the end. Prigozhin's whereabouts are unclear, and there was no immediate confirmation his forces were actually approaching the city. But since this has been written, it's been really remarkable to see that, again, he's now saying that the Council of Wagner commanders have decided to deal with the military leadership of Russia, and that he will destroy everyone in his way. He says he's released videos of him going through this is a telegram of him going through the Wagner camp and being like, this is where they hit us. This is how many people have passed away. It's been a real, just onslaught for us. And it seems like they are still kind of continuing for it to go on here, which is really pretty remarkable. So, so you can see all this. BBC Russia is reporting that the FSB and the SOBR, the National Guard Spetsnaz, are setting up roadblocks around Moscow. Security forces are put on high alert, and the fortress plan to protect government buildings in the city have been activated. Alarms are spreading, and alarm just in general are spreading in the city. We're starting, said a Telegram channel associated with Wagner posts. We've already seen videos of them now coming in, moving into, even as military vehicles are rolling down the streets of Moscow, military vehicles are also have been rolling in to the Rostov-on-Don city. We've seen troops kind of surrounding a main government building with armed and almost kind of ready to strike. Wagner-aligned Telegram channels are not impressed with the statements of General quote-unquote Armageddon Surovikin, publishing a video calling the Wagner Group to obey the Supreme Commander, saying, I have just returned by order of the Ministry of Defense from the Zero Line, where our forces, our commanders, our soldiers, volunteers are carrying out the objective, fighting the superior enemy forces to death, taking casualties, but stand on their positions. I appeal to the leadership, commanders, and fighters of PMC Wagner. Together with you, we walked a difficult path. Together with you, we fought risks. We took risks, we took losses, but overcame together. We have the same blood. We are warriors. I call on you to stop. That enemy is waiting for our eternal political situation to aggravate. We should not play into the enemy's hands in this difficult time for the country. So in response, the Wagner Group says, all the generals who tell the musicians, meaning Wagner, to stop, with shaking hands to stop, have already actually signed their sentence. Surovikin will be responsible for the surrender of Kherson, which is pretty severe accusation. It has really been a pretty big moment. It seems a little unreal. It seems surreal because all this stuff is, again, primarily coming first on Twitter, and Twitter, even as, a social media site, didn't have a lot of credibility and has lost a lot of credibility since Elon Musk takeover in terms of validity of information that you can trust coming out of places like this. But it is clear he has put out these videos. He has made his play. He has made his accusations against the Russian government, and it's very, very clear. No matter what happens, he has, in the words of some, and I think it's pretty clear, he has crossed the Rubicon, and the opening of the criminal case against him now means he has little incentive to back down, saying he is fully committed to pushing, as he puts it, again, all the way to the end. Russian media now apparently saying, quote, using advantage of Prigozhin's protection, the Kiev regime in the Artemov tactical direction is preparing for an offensive, saying pretty much because of the chaos and confusion, Zelensky forces are going to, use this to push further, which, why wouldn't they? I mean, come on. U.S. administration officials are confirming to CNN, this is real. That's the only quote. Apparently they're covering it all in the White House at the moment. There's apparently an emergency broadcast going on in Russian television at the moment. This is from one analyst who is the founder CEO at R Politik, senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, whose name is Tatiana Stanovaya, who is a Russian analyst apparently, saying there are a few insights into the situation surrounding Prigozhin. For a long time, Prigozhin has been out of direct contact with Putin, yet he's believed he was acting in Putin's interests by default. His significant contributions to the war enhanced his sense of exclusivity and privilege. Interestingly enough, he was a St. Petersburg restaurateur who ended up leveraging connections that he was able to obtain with Putin and the Putin government into some pretty big contracts. He gained international promise after his online troll factory interfered in the 2016 presidential election. So he was one of those Facebook guys that was causing all these people, all this kind of consternation. And he was also deployed Wagner fighters across Syria and across Africa as a shadow force believed to be fighting for Kremlin interests. Kind of really one of the leaders over the last few years in terms of the global great power struggle for, against the U.S. in a lot of these areas. So he's definitely, no friend of the U.S., at least in the past. For months, though, the Russian war effort has been hampered by this bitter feud between Prigozhin and other top military leaders, whom he has accused of scathing terms of incompetence in conducting the war. He's asserted Russia's top brass have refused to provide Wagner forces with the needed ammunition, even as they fought alongside Russian military for control of Ukrainian forces in the city of Bakhmut. For control of the city of Bakhmut, which they eventually, I think, did obtain. But it was a very, very hard-fought struggle, which essentially left the city in rubble. But never before had Prigozhin accused Russia's military leaders of attacking his forces, nor said in such dark terms the Kremlin's stated justification for the war was nonsense. In a 30-minute video released on Friday, Prigozhin had said that, again, it was a racket, his country's invasion of Ukraine, that was meant to just essentially help the elite and did not care really at all about Russian lives. He apparently is also, a big target of his ire has been the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. He accused Shoigu of orchestrating a deadly attack with missiles and helicopters on the camps to the rear of the Russian lines in Ukraine, where his soldiers were kind of really hamstrung there and kind of stopped at that time. He accused Shoigu of overseeing the strikes himself from the town of Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia, now where they are currently moving in. The mercenary leader's claims cannot immediately be verified, and the Dmitry S. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said that Putin was aware of all events around Prigozhin, according to Interfax, a Russian news agency. Prigozhin's accusations created a ripple effect among Russian pro-war activists who fear that an open conflict between the army and Wagner forces could threaten some of the Russian front lines during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And Ukraine so viewed his statements as more evidence of internal divisions within the Russian war effort. So he interestingly said that Prigozhin, he really tried to frame this as, a guy, Putin, who's just being led astray. He casted him as a leader being misled by some of his officials, but he did dismiss some of the Kremlin narrative. But, I don't know what's more offensive, at least to Putin, to say, he's a guy who is leading his country wrong intentionally, or he's just being duped. He is not the alpha dog, the top dog in the situation. He's being duped by military officials who are only in it for themselves. I don't know which one would get under his skin more. So his Wagner troops, composed of veteran fighters as well as thousands of convicts whom Prigozhin personally recruited from Russian prisons, provided proved key in capturing the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut in May after a months-long battle. But during the Battle of Bakhmut, Prigozhin also emerged as a populist political figure, excoriating Russia's military leadership for corruption. His angry recordings and videos posted to the Telegram messaging network cast top military and Kremlin officials as unaware and uncaring of the struggles of regular Russian soldiers. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see. Again, this kind of Rubicon has been crossed. Really, really remarkable stuff. This is just in from the New York Times. So the governor of Russia's Lipetsk region said that traffic was blocked along a stretch of the M4, a major north-south highway that runs for hundreds of miles from Moscow to the Black Sea and passes through Rostov-on-Don. The governor, this is again where the Wagner troops are believed to have kind of quote-unquote occupied the city at the moment of Rostov-on-Don. They are, apparently now seeing traffic blocked on the highway that goes straight through Rostov-on-Don to the Black Sea on one end and really straight to the Moscow on the other side. So that is kind of what they're doing at the moment, which is really very interesting. Up they go now. It's apparently about an 11-hour drive. It's going to be interesting to see what happens next. The governor, again, Igor Artemonov, said on Telegram the blockage was at the border of the Lipetsk and Voronezh regions. The governor of Voronezh, directly north of the Rostov region, said earlier that a convoy of military equipment was moving along the highway. This is just 2 minutes ago. This was reported from the New York Times. So that already shows you, if you're wondering where Rostov-on-Don is, it is significantly. This is just where a few hours ago we saw clips of them, kind of entering the city, entering buildings, kind of surrounding buildings. Apparently, they are now above Rostov and are significantly, almost halfway to, it looks like, Moscow at the moment, and entering, the Lipetsk Oblast, which is even further north from Voronezh, and getting even closer to Moscow at this time, which is really, really remarkable stuff. So Prigozhin should have already handed over to a military tribunal for many things. There was a rough quote there for me, but it was from Igor Girkin, a former paramilitary commander who has often himself criticized Russia's top brass from the right, almost saying they're not doing enough to kind of attack Ukraine and be more pro-war, essentially. Now, Kirkin says he can also be handed over for treason. So here I do want. We're going to take a quick break here, but after that we'll have more analysis for you coming out of Russia and more. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening and supporting Newsflash. We now have a brand new way for you to be heard if you want, whether a text message or a audio message. Please, no video messages. I really just do not think that's necessary. We have a new feedback box open for you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is officially open. SWRN702@gmail.com. Send a text message, send a voice message of no more than 30 seconds via the voice memos function. Either of those two options, and we will 100%, not going to find this guarantee anywhere else. We're going to play it on the show, listen to what you have to say, and it literally could be about anything. Well, if it's inappropriate, we won't play it, but it could be about anything. Thank you so much. This is my thank you to all the listeners who have stuck out with us and want to have their own voice in the show. SWRN702@gmail.com is the address. All right, so now we go to some more analysis here for you from Tatiana Stanovaya, who is a Russian analyst on Twitter. Some pretty interesting stuff she had to say. So she says the president's administration maintained the stance that unless explicitly directed, it was not feasible to openly confront Prigozhin despite a strong inclination to do so. They, in fact, had even been convinced themselves of his usefulness. As I previously stated, the atrocities of war can drive people to the brink of sanity. Even the most loyal players who are dependent on the Kremlin, which does not imply complete manageability, can lose their sense of proportion. This is especially true when it appears to be no response to the continual attempts to escalate the situation. Now that the state has actively engaged, there's no turning back. The termination of Prigozhin and Wagner is imminent. The only possibility now is absolute obliteration, with degrees of resistance from the Wagner Group being the only variable. Surovikin was dispatched to convince them to surrender. Confrontation seems totally futile. The impending end of Wagner satisfied many in power. He had become an excessively anti-state, which is intolerable during war for the Russian side. However, a significant number of those outside of power now lament the loss of a character like Prigozhin, who had begun to appeal due to his daring and audacity. Consequently, political repercussions are now to be expected. A crucial point to note is that many within the elite will now personally fault Putin for letting the situation escalate to such extremes and for his lack of a timely, adequate response to when to many it was evident that Prigozhin was also pushing the limits of the Kremlin's tolerance. We talked about some of these broadsides he's been putting up against the Kremlin for quite some time. Therefore, this kind of entire saga was a big undercut to Putin's standing now, especially now for the first time really within the country as well. Prigozhin released an audio message claiming elements of the Wagner border had crossed into Russia and faced no resistance. It'll be interesting to see how long that lasts. It seems like, for what little resistance that they will face on the way to Moscow is largely going to be from very, very isolated forces, people not really wanting to engage, but then they got that Moscow, the fortress plan to prevent coups has already been in place, so it seems to be a very, very interesting situation. The Ministry of Defense, the FSB, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the Russian Guard report to Putin around the clock on the messages and the measures taken after the instructions given by the head of state in connection with the attempted armed rebellion. So they're certainly treating this here as an armed rebellion. So Mikhail Rozavayev, the governor of occupied Sevastopol, said, like many of you, I am not sleeping. I am updating my news feed. Any conflict is bad. A conflict of this level is bad in the extreme. Prigozhin's post on VKontakte, the Russian version of Facebook, have now been blocked by order of the government. Search results for Prigozhin on Yandex, the largest Russian search engine, are now also being censored. Senators Warner and Rubio called tonight's events significant internal conflict among Russian forces. These are, again, two Republicans with high clearance on the Senate Intelligence Committee, calling their events significantly important among Russian forces. Reported footage of Wagner vehicles on the M4 motorway towards Rostov. We are now hearing that they are already well beyond Rostov and now approaching the Lipetsk region, which is about halfway from their first reported point, Rostov-on-Don, kind of by the Ukrainian border, now way up north and slightly to the east in the way to Moscow. Another message from Prigozhin saying he's going after Shoigu and Gerasimov as revenge for having destroyed about 100,000 Russian soldiers during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which he claims was launched under false pretenses. Apparently, we've already had our first firefights between Russian soldiers and Wagner mercenaries outside of Rostov, but apparently that does not qualify as, quote, more than a little resistance from Prigozhin. The Rostov Oblast Governor Vasily Golubev says law enforcement agencies are doing anything necessary and everything necessary to ensure the safety of residents in the area. I ask everyone to stay calm and do not leave home without need. Multiple videos of the Wagner convoys in Rostov are now emerging as dawn is breaking in the region. We will see more, I'm sure, as the hours go on. As a large number of Russian military helicopters are flying around Rostov this morning. The Mi-8s transporting helicopters, Mi-8 transport helicopters, the Ka-52 and the Mi-28 helicopter gunships are coming in. So many sightings of them, at least in Rostov, and continued clips of multiple times where you can see Russian riot police and kind of low-level police standing by and letting the convoy pass. Obviously they're probably going to not want to pick a fight they can't win, but also the question is, are they, essentially letting this happen as well? This is seeing the red Z is on these tanks now, which could be a possible, mark for the attempted coup here that we are seeing. That Southern Military District building in Rostov, it was the building that was referencing earlier, the government building that the Wagner forces are now surrounding and attempting to seize. The Wagner forces are apparently have controlled the streets and are now pushing off. And now, at least as we know, this is kind of the latest here at this point, which I find to be very interesting. It's now saying Lipetsk is now going to be the next big focus, where they're seeing traffic blocking off. How quickly can they move? It'll be very, very interesting. It's still likely to be playing out in a big way. This very well could be completely out of date by the morning. But as we stand, key, just give you a lot of details there. Let's sum it all up before we move on. Key details are the Wagner Group, the mercenary top fighting force that has really been helping the Russian army on the Ukrainian war, led by this guy, Evgeny Prigozhin, has turned against the Russian government, saying that they have launched a war in Ukraine on false pretenses, and at the very least have made turn their army back into Russia, directing it up toward Moscow. Around 25,000 strong, all in tanks and very well armored, it seems, have been at least going on Rostov-on-Don, a city very close to the Ukrainian border, traveling up north, roughly northeast down the M4 highway, and apparently now halfway to Moscow, according to New York Times reporting. So that seems to be very, very interesting. There's a fortress plan in place on Moscow, and it seems like we are not at the end of this conflict, which is growing in severity in a big way. All right. That is the major stuff from all things Russia. Let's go to our next story. All right. So we also found a little bit of a kind of return to the the main news of the day, or at least leading up to before this point, was the Titan submersible. So this is a little piece here in the New York Times talking about it. On one vessel, 5 people died on a very expensive excursion that was supposed to return them to the lives they knew. On the other, perhaps 500 people died just days earlier on a squalid and perilous voyage, fleeing poverty and violence in search of new lives. After contact was lost with 5 inside a submersible descending to the Titanic, multiple countries and private entities sent ships, planes, and underwater drones to pursue a faint hope of rescue, which apparently they had heard that the explosion was screwed up the explosion and the explosion of the spoiler alert, the sub imploded on itself because of the pressure. And they had known about it for days and kept looking. But anyway, the point is that was all happening. Tons of government resources were completely expended, all while this tragedy was happening in Greece that we talked about a few days on the show, where 500 people died after an overloaded boat carrying migrants across the Mediterranean completely turned over. At first, taking a look at the Titanic story, there's a lot to be, completely obsessed over. The fact that this billionaire, leader, of the sub company was actively, happy to break safety rules, telling people about how, no, you can't do great things with safety. That just gets in the way of greatness. Was essentially what his take was there. So he, allowed people to do extraordinary dangerous things. $250,000 was what people paid on this, for the sub that was assembled with parts from Camping World and was controlled with a PlayStation controller. But people ended up doing it, and I think that is really what fascinates people, is why the hubris of trying to pay $250,000 to go into the sea, to go down the Titanic, to go, super, super duper far, and just thinking you can do it by cutting all these corners, by being super, cool and entrepreneurial, and, just getting past all the regulations, and then just popping like a blueberry down there is really quite something. I think it shows you, it's kind of, I think, a very reaffirming thing for a lot of people, because it shows you, when it comes down to it, some things you need to do, some things, there's some corners you just can't cut, and there's some things that money just really can't buy, and the entire sea is frankly one of them. But again, that also puts in contrast this other kind of moral facet of what do we do about the migrants, and that's something I guess much more for the tragedy of tragedy of scale. It's like, this is a crazy, unique thing, whereas the migrant situation is something that we hear and see so much about, and I think really feel that, like, there is nothing we can do in any kind of substantive manner. There is nothing that we can know that we can return to, especially as Americans, because we have our own migrant problems for sure, but we're not going to be able to pressure our government to doing something better. But it's another one of those kind of mundane, acceptable, normalized tragedies where we see, massive amounts of people die. Just say, oh, thank God that's not us. Just move on, because we know there's nothing that our governments will do about it, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So at a certain level, I think really just like some of the school shootings that we see in America, just people have decided to, move on in a very, very tragic way. I think that kind of explains it. Definitely doesn't justify it. And that definitely does not mean Newsflash will not stop covering both stories, especially, if anything, giving more presence to the story of the plight of migrants in the world, because somebody has got to keep an eye on what is going on in that world, in that front. And we certainly will be doing that here on Newsflash. All right. We are going now to shift gears to our last story of the day. In a blistering attack on her Senate colleague last week, Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois warned independent Arizona Senator that a proposal, Kristen Sinema, that's who it was, the only one, warned her that a proposal to reduce the number of required in-flight training hours for pilots would result in blood on your hands. So the attack from Duckworth was prompted by an amendment supported by Sinema and John Thune of South Dakota that would allow pilots to meet training requirements by substituting hours spent in a flight simulator for actual flight time. So again, it doesn't matter for her; she'll be flying private anyway. For Duckworth, who lost both of her legs to a rocket attack on the Black Hawk helicopter she was piloting in the 2004 Iraq War, the issue was personal. Not the time to put corporate profits out of the lives of constituents who may want to board a commercial flight in the future, Duckworth said. A vote to reduce the 1,500-hour rule for pilots training will mean blood on your hands when an inevitable accident occurs as a result of an inadequately trained flight crew. The 11th-hour amendment in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation comes as the September 30th deadline to reauthorize the Federal Aviation Act looms. Sinema's campaign received an influx of cash over the last year from the airline industry. No surprise. The donations would be crucial to the senator as she strikes out a newly christened independent, Christian independent during her challenging re-election bid. Without her Democratic Party affiliation, Sinema heads the 2024 race without the political or financial backing of her former party. Sinema's amendment is being opposed by pilot and flight attendant unions, saying, quote, any change to the rule must have sign-off from the pilots or we don't trust it, said Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of the Flight Attendants, CWA, representing about 50,000 flight attendants. She said it's that simple. She apparently has raised $150,000 from the airline industry over the past 2 election cycles. $150K. Sinema's top donors included the trade group Airlines for America, in addition to regional carriers like Alaska Airlines. And Sinema's office, no surprise, didn't respond to an Intercept request for comment. She most likely, is going to lose her reelection, probably get squeezed out. The only question is, will she spoil enough Democratic votes off of Ruben Gallego to stop her, spoil enough votes to, let the Republicans sneak through. But it is, very, very rare. I think it's almost kind of good that Kristen Sinema is where she is, because she really shows and exemplifies all the problems of the system. Because what she's really doing is saying, is there a flaw here? Is there a problem here? Is there something that, is not being followed or, just not being sensibly taken care of? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to exploit it to make money for myself. And just pointing out all the loopholes from her, and also combined with the fact that she's probably going to lose her next election, makes her an incredibly great exemplar for all the faults with, just American democracy and the current American system as a whole. All right, that's all we got. We are back on Monday or possibly sooner. Things really go crazy out in Russia. Have a great weekend, everyone. It's Newsflash.